You're 22 and you're suddenly in command of 44 riflemen. You get to the end, the Marines throw grenades, I take cover, and the guy next to me is a private first class. He starts yelling, "I'm hit." And I'm like, how are you hit? We're behind this berm.
Right.
And he had taken cover with his arm on top of the berm. And sure enough, he's got a big piece of shrapnel sticking out of his wrist. I'm thinking, oh, cool, I'm going to get fired, week 2 of the Marine Corps.
On this episode, a conversation with David Kinzler. Now, Dave, he's got a great story. Naval Academy graduate. After that, spent some time in the Marine Corps as an officer, 4 deployments, 1 combat deployment to Afghanistan. After that, spent some time on Capitol Hill working for former Senator Bob Corker. Now today, he's the CEO of an innovative company in the healthcare space called 1-to-1 Health. Our conversation was a long one, so long in fact we broke it into 2 parts. Today, we're going to focus on a couple of things that I like to talk about, the Marine Corps and leadership.
I got to, grab this guy's shoulder and kind of wake him up, which is always an awkward position to be in. So he wakes up, and he said, "What?" I said, "Well, sir, Pissy Smiley hit himself with a grenade." And he goes, "You got it?" I'm like, "Yes, sir." He's okay. I've got it. He goes, "Okay." And he falls back asleep. And like that for me was such an empowering moment of like, hey, like, you know what you're doing. I've got trust and confidence in you. Like, go operate. And I was like, okay, like I can do this.
My name is Josh Rowe, and this is Tomorrowtown, Tennessee. As someone like myself who enjoys reading military history type things, man, there's so much interesting pieces of history connected to the Naval Academy. Tell me about what that was like.
Yeah, no, it was. I was probably very similar to you as a kid, where I was very into military history, reading everything I could get my hands on, and kind of always knew I wanted to serve in some capacity. If you asked me as a kid, I probably would not have said, I definitely want to be a Marine officer, which is what I ended up becoming. I was kind of interested in it all. I wanted to be a fighter pilot, tanks, try to be a Navy SEAL, whatever it is. But I knew that I wanted to serve. And so when I started looking at the service academies, if you look at Army, Air Force, Navy, coming out of the Naval Academy, you can do anything that you can do coming out of the other service academies. Like, you want to fly a fighter jet, you can do that in the Navy or Marine Corps. If you want to be on a ship, a submarine, Navy SEAL, you can do that. Or if you want to go to the Marine Corps, which has all the ground specialties and attack helicopters, fighter jets, and so kind of left my options open.
Sure.
And then going to your point of the history of the academy. You can serve coming out of any background. You can enlist. You can go to any college, go to OCS, become an officer. There's no requirement to go to the academy, but for me, it was the perfect place to kind of learn the profession that I did for that time period. And it was when you're going, when you're walking down, a pathway called Decatur. It's it's kind of imbued in you. Well, who is Decatur? What did he do? What are those values? The library's Nimitz Hall. Who was Admiral Nimitz? And it becomes a little bit of a part of you.
Yeah. I remember Marine Corps boot camp learning. They have they give you at the time, this is the 90s, so I don't know how it is today, but they give you this thing they call the Green Monster. And it's this thick just book of everything you can think of, from how a tourniquet works to history of Admiral Nimitz to all that stuff. And so, when you're talking about this kind of stuff, I go back to sitting in a cold, giant room that looks almost like a hangar of some kind, and then trying to not fall asleep because you'd been working all day, right? And now they're trying to teach you about all the Marine Corps history. And so I think that's fascinating that, as you're there on that campus, you're kind of learning it. You're obviously in college and preparing for your military career, but also you're learning this history in real time.
Yeah, and I use it today all the time. Like, if I said message to Garcia to you, you probably know what that means. But I use it talking right now to our employees of the idea of the story of Message Garcia. Is the president sent out an officer to go get a message to Garcia with no other amplifying information. The officer had to trudge through the jungles, figure out but the officer got it done. It was, all right, I have my task. I'm going to figure out how to get this done, and I'm going to do it. And those types of lessons have all sorts of implications for the private sector as well.
Man, I could talk to you for hours about this topic, because I think that's interesting, because when you talk about and we're going to divert a little bit here. So just bear with me here. When you talk about leadership in corporate world type thing and military leadership, it seems that so often these are not the same ideas. These are, and that idea of Message Garcia, right, is no, you may not have all the answers and all the information you need, but you got to get the job done. Totally. And I feel like that there's something that going through military career that I went through, there's something in that you really learn how to do that. Like there's not a correct answer maybe, but there are options that could lead you to a correct answer.
Yeah.
And having the ability to navigate that is so valuable. Can you just speak to that, going from military world to now corporate world, and kind of how you see those things changing?
Yeah. I think there's a common archetype of people expect a Marine officer to be a disciplinarian, authoritative. And that was kind of my fear of the Marine Corps going into it. And when I joined the Marine Corps, that was absolutely not what I found. So my first company commander, I was a rifle platoon commander. My first company commander was a guy named Brian Chantosh, who Chantosh is one of the most decorated Marines from the war in Iraq. And so he has a Navy Cross from the march up where it's all publicly documented. He drove his Humvee into a trench line and cleared the entire trench line by himself. And then I have a couple Bronze Stars on top of that too, I believe, from the Battle of Fallujah. But so I showed up, and this was my direct boss, this legend. And you expect him, you expect that authoritarian disciplinarian. And so I showed up, and we immediately went overseas to Kuwait. I'd had my platoon for maybe a week. And so like anything in life, they give the new guy a basic task to see, can you perform? Can you do some small stuff right? And so my basic task was to run a training range in the desert of Kuwait. And it was a squad online. So 12 Marines all moving and shooting in one direction, one axis. So it's pretty simple. You've got nothing crossing. You're not going to hit each other. We'd built a berm at the end where you throw a grenade at the end. And you take cover behind the berm. And so I set this all up. I walk behind that first squad as they're going down just to observe it, make sure everything's going okay. We get to the end, the Marines throw grenades, I take cover, and the guy next to me is a private first class. He starts yelling, "I'm hit." And I'm like, how are you hit? We're behind this berm.
Right.
And he had taken cover with his arm on top of the berm. And sure enough, he's got a big piece of shrapnel sticking out of his wrist. I'm thinking, oh, cool, I'm going to get fired, week 2 of the Marine Corps. So I go back, and I got to tell Chantosh, this legend, that in my first day on the job, my first real day on the job, one of our Marines hit himself with a grenade. So we walk up, we were on the middle of the desert. So he was under camouflage netting, which was over the ammunition to keep it cool, and he's asleep. And so I gotta, grab this guy's shoulder and kind of wake him up, which is always an awkward position to be in. So he wakes up. And I said, "What?" I said, "Well, sir, PFC Smiley hit himself with a grenade." And he goes, "You got it?" I'm like, "Yes, sir." He's okay. I've got it. He goes, "Okay," and he falls back asleep. And like that for me was such an empowering moment of like, hey, like, you know what you're doing. I've got trust and confidence in you. Like, go operate. And I was like, okay, like I can do this. And so bringing that mentality of, as a leader, I'm going to give you my intent, but I'm going to then allow decentralized execution. Now, because to your point, I think people want to be given the right answer, but none of us know exactly the right answer. And so if I can give you the general intent, here's where we want to go. Like, we want to remove barriers to access to primary care. We want to have great quality of care. We want to have great customer service. And we want everything we do to be aligned with the appropriate incentives. And then let's go figure out, and I need this big team to figure out how to actually do that and empower them to do the same thing that he did for me. Like, hey, you've got this. You're capable. You're trained. You know what you're doing. Go do it.
That's a great explanation of that. I often see this idea of, as opposed to doing what I need to do to make this person successful, to make the team better, instead I need you to do this thing for me, execute that thing for me, as opposed to making the emphasis on that person. And I think that military, often that's exactly what you want. I don't need this person to be able to execute X, Y, Z. I need this person to be able to problem solve. I need this person to be able to operate in a way that they're going to figure this out just because they're a smart person and they're trained well, and et cetera, et cetera.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think that so much in the corporate world, we're missing a lot of that. Yeah. Just giving people the autonomy and the authority to just go and be creative. And
then ultimately what you give them, I think, is a sense of purpose at work because they find value in what they're doing. They've got autonomy over what they're doing. They've got control over the outcomes, and ultimately it can be a little scary. You kind of dive into the deep end sometimes with limited guidance, but once you learn to swim there, I think you're off to the races. Yeah.
So tell me about your Marine Corps career. You were so post Naval Academy. How long were you in?
8 years.
8 years. So and I think we talked about 4 deployments, not all combat deployments, but 4 deployments total. Tell me about that experience and kind of what that. What you learned from that and what do you take away from all those things?
Yeah, those were absolutely my formative years because you're 22 and you're suddenly in command of 44 riflemen. Yeah. And so, you show up and you are quickly the adult in the room for even if you're not an adult, which maybe I probably wasn't at that time. But just on a human level, you get, as I'm sure this was your experience too, you immediately get exposed to just a much broader cross-section of America than you probably were before you joined. No matter what your background is, there's going to be a much broader section of America that suddenly are your brothers and sisters in arms. And then your job is to go ahead and lead them in combat, which is just a wild amount of responsibility. And so you kind of progress through that and gain more experience and confidence as you go. The training, the Marine Corps training for me was absolutely formative in that the Marine Corps does a great job for officer training, sending very high caliber officers to the basic school where you go to be 6 months. Every Marine officer goes there for basic officer training. And then to the infantry officer course, which is 3 months right after that. And so you get 9 months for an infantry officer, you get 9 months of fairly specific training of how to do this. So the day you show up, at least in domain expertise, you're pretty good. You know what you're doing, and the leaders that you've been exposed to are all by far the highest caliber. In fact, For me, it's when you show up to the operating forces, you expect everybody to be that way, and of course they're not. And so that was a little bit of an adjustment of saying, "Oh wow, like some of these people do not walk on water," and learning that was a challenge as well. But that core group of officers that I served with under John Tosh are still my closest friends. I said I was a second lieutenant when I showed up. My XO at the time leads all virtual operations at 1-to-1 now. And so lives here in Chattanooga, and it works with 1-to-1.
Did you bring them in?
So yeah,
went out and recruit them.
Yeah, our clinics have been around. Our physical clinics have been around since 2013. Keith founded the company in 2013. I joined 2021 and kind of came up with the idea of this scalable version of concierge medicine in the latter half of 2021. And I realized, okay, we still got a business to run, and I need somebody that can come in and put together these pieces and launch this virtual care product. And so Tillman Ensley is his name, close friend of mine. He was at Facebook. So he was infantry officer with me, special operator for 5 years, went in the CIA, was a paramilitary officer, business school, Facebook. And so I had to convince him for a while, but ultimately convinced him to come down and kind of launch this virtual product for us. And thankfully he did.
You graduate the Naval Academy, and then for an infantry officer in the Marine Corps, there's 9 months of schooling after that before you're sent out into the world to be an officer. I don't think even people who serve like I did understand that process, because like you mentioned, most of the officers I was around went through OCS in some way. And so kind of explain that process of the steps you have to take even after you finish the Naval Academy.
Yeah. So just to be commissioned as an officer, there's kind of 2 training routes. There's officer candidate school if you don't go to a service academy, and then there's a service academy if you do. But once you're commissioned, you've done one of those 2 things. And in the Marine Corps, every officer goes to the basic school in Quantico, Virginia, 6 months long. And the basic school is training every Marine officer how to be a basic infantry officer. And so it's really rooted in that foundation of, the Marine Corps is centered on the infantry, every Marine or rifleman. We've got this ethos of hey, everybody, we're centered on the warfighter. And so that's gives every Marine officer this common ground. So, when I'm on the radio talking to an F-18, a Marine F-18 pilot trying to call in close air support, that pilot knows what it feels like for me. They know what it feels like on the ground. We have this kind of base of commonality, and you can go through that on every specialty. Then at the end of that 6 months, you get what your military occupational specialty, what your specific job is going to be, and they use a third system, and so they split the class into thirds. And so if it's 100 people, number 1 picks first, and then number 33, and then 67, and then number 2, 34, 68. And the idea there is to get an even quality spread across all of the specialties. And so if everybody, there's very few tank officer slots. And so if there's only 2 tank officer slots, they don't want somebody in the top, only officers from the top 10 of the class going into tanks. They want to make sure that you're getting an even spread across everything. And so I selected the infantry. At the time, infantry is typically competitive to get. At the time, this was 2007. And so we were trying to get more infantry officers at that time. We probably took maybe 30 some infantry officers, maybe a little more actually. And then from there you go to your specialty school. So mine was the infantry officer course. If you're a communications officer, you're going to go to that school. If you're a tank officer, you're going to go learn tanks. And so for the infantry officer course, that's 3 months. And that's an advanced infantry training. And so you're learning, you're spending 3 months learning. It's very, very tactically focused. And of course, all of it is imbued with leadership and how to actually lead a platoon of Marines. But you come out of it with a very solid tactical foundation of how to fight.
Yeah. I think that's a big difference between training as an officer in the Marine Corps and training as an enlisted person in the Marine Corps. My experience was, you go to boot camp, and at the time MCT, Marine Combat Training, and then you go to your MOS school, and I was an MP, and so your time is very focused on this is your job. How do you be an expert at your job, as opposed to learning a lot of, like you said, operational military combat type tactics and kind of different scenarios. It's a very different kind of a mindset, I think. Officer training versus enlisted training, depending on your job, I'm sure.
Yeah, and it's really valuable because you show up at that time. So it's 2008, and so I show up to a platoon, and all these guys have fought in Iraq, and so I show up, take command of a platoon that has been there, done that, and suddenly I'm in charge of them, having never been in combat, and so that's a little bit of you have that uncertainty in the back of your mind of, should I really be leading these guys? Can I lead these guys? Will I be able to do it? And I remember that first deployment, we actually got on ships to go over to the Middle East. And so we had a couple weeks of really nothing to do. And so you try to create things for the Marines to do, which I'm sure you remember some of them positive, so hopefully.
Sure.
And so I asked one of the Lance Corporals who'd done an Iraq deployment as a PFC. I said, okay, now you're a team leader. Come up with a basic patrolling class, and let's and I want to, and you teach your team how to patrol. So I go down into the belly of the ship, and I kind of watch the first one. I'm like, all right, Lance Corporal, show me what you've come up with. And he starts talking through, and I'm like, what is this based on, man? And he said, well, this is kind of how I did it. And I'm like, there is a Marine Corps publication, 3 TAC 11 patrolling. Like, how about we start with that? And so you really do, as an officer, you come out, you don't realize it, how much you know, until you come out and you kind of see the general knowledge level of, and also the foundation that it gives you of where to go. Hey, There's a publication called Machine Guns and Machine Gun Gunnery. We don't need to make this up. Like it's written down. It's pretty clear what the best practices are. Let's start with that before we start modifying it.
That's interesting. Yeah. And I could talk Marine Corps stuff all day, but I don't want to do that to you. So let me ask one more question. You said you had 4 deployments. Were 2 combat?
No, one was
combat related. Everybody, I think, when you hear that, there's some interest in like, okay, what was that like? And as you said, you made that decision, knowing full well that there were 2 wars in 2 countries going on in this country, and that being an infantry officer in the Marine Corps, chances were you're going to go over there and see some things. And so it's a decision that you made, consciously. Just tell me kind of the mindset of that decision, and then what that deployment was like. What did you? Obviously, combat is it's hard to think about and hard to talk about when you know the realities of it. And so just your takeaway from that experience.
Yeah. Experience is the right word. Like I think it's kind of the sum of all human experiences. We all have we all have the same emotions, same core of emotions. It's just, I think combat amplifies all those to the extreme. It's everything just all there kind of distilled into one moment, or one experience. For me, you don't find yourself in the infantry at the height of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan unless you want to go do that. It would be very rare for somebody to be there that doesn't. And so you're in a culture, and this is often odd to people, you're in a culture where people want to go fight. And so I came home from my second deployment in, I believe it was probably December of 2009. And right around Christmas, and you go on leave for Christmas, you come back. I was engaged. My wife and I moved in together. So I'd kind of taken my then fiance. So I'd taken her out of the town, and we were in Southern California at the time, but away from her friends, down closer to Camp Pendleton. Went to work on that first day. And the battalion commander called me and one other officer up, and he said, "Hey, we've got a request for forces for one rifle company to go to Afghanistan in 12 days.
12 days.
12 days.
Boy.
And so, you're actually really excited when you get that call. It's like, all right, we're going to go do it. Then you got to go home and tell your fiance. That's that's definitely a different set of emotions. But you're excited to go do it without a doubt. And it was for me, it was my first patrol. We went into Southern Garmsir, and Garmsir is an area in the Helmand River Valley along the Helmand River. And so if you think of it, there's a river and there's irrigation canals coming off of it, but it's actually pretty, and beyond on the either side of those, so there's farmland, but on either side of that, it's just desert. So it creates this narrow strip of land, maybe 1.5 kilometers in some areas, of greenery. And that's where everybody lives, and that's where all the fighting is, but it's just this long north to south running corridor. And at the time, the Marines had cleared to so far south, but south of that was pure Taliban country. And so our job was to clear down to an area called Safar Bazaar. We colloquially called it the fish hook because the river hooked there. And that was an area of the Taliban fully controlled, lots of bad stuff coming out of there. So, hey, we're going to push down and clear down to Safar Bazaar. And so we showed up kind of on the edge of the empire, and there was a Marine outpost there. I think it was called Fob Gorgak, and they didn't have enough room for us, so we went up onto this big hill above it. Just no walls, no posts, nothing. Just let's ring ourselves in machine guns and outposts, and then plan for the push south. We would run in those first couple of days. We ran a couple patrols. The plan was to run some patrols south to go figure out what we were going to do, where we were going to go, get used to the area. And on that first one, it was we were joined with Marines. I was 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines. We were joined with Marines from 2nd Battalion, 2nd Marines, 2-2. And so with 2-2, it was mostly 2-2 Marines, and then a couple of our officers, our sniper team, a couple others. And we started pushing south. And we came to a spot where it was, so we were running east to west. The river runs north-south. We were east to west, kind of clearing down. Mm-hmm. And you could see the Taliban emplacing guys in a L shape around us. And so you knew there was a fight coming. And I remember and so we're on a very, very, it wasn't an irrigation canal. I'd call it like irrigation ditch. It's just this little tiny berm that's maybe a foot high. And so we stopped there, small tree line, and we're looking south. And I remember there were actual tumbleweeds going across the area in between us. You're like, wow, there's tumbleweeds before this fight. So you're kind of, but you're amped up. You're kind of excited for it. And the first shot was taken by one of our snipers, Trujillo, and he actually missed his first. So that 300-yard shot, which for a sniper should hit all day, and the bullet went right by the guy's head, and the dude kind of waved at him, ducked behind cover, and then at that point, it kind of erupted all around us. And when it erupts, your adrenaline is super high, and you're like, I got this. You're moving, you're on the radio, and then right after that, the machine gunner next to me. So we're in the prone shooting. The machine gunner next to me got shot in the foot. It was actually in the ankle. And you start doing the mental math of, wait, where was that bullet that this dude is lying in the prone behind this little berm, and it hits him in the ankle. And so you can think of the volume of fire coming over you. And then his A gunner, who's feeding the rounds in, looks at me, and he's got a red mark right across his cheek. And so you start feeling pretty vulnerable pretty quick. And then right after that, one of our Marines got hit, square in the head. And so at that moment, you kind of, the reality of it comes down to you, and you're, all right, like that adrenaline is still getting you through, but you very quickly realize what it is you're actually doing and how vulnerable you are. But then over that deployment, so every day you're going out there in an area largely controlled by the Taliban. And shortly after that, we moved up to Marja, which the Marine Corps invaded. We actually weren't part of the initial invasion, but we came in and took the southwestern corner of Marja, which there's nobody there. And so it was this hotbed tempest of Taliban activity. And so every single day you're going out, you're walking into a fight. But it is also this like very pure distilled experience of, what your purpose is. Like you know what you're doing. Now, is that purpose of what you're doing on the ground connected to any broader strategy and national interest? Maybe not, but it's not what you're concerned with at that moment. And so it is like, on one hand, this incredible experience. And it's also, it can be very comedic. Like when you are behind one of those berms and there's machine gun fire raking over your head, you're looking at your buddy and you're kind of laughing at just how crazy this is at this moment, which also I think sounds weird to people. But then, it is just this. It is a crazy experience, and so I think a lot of guys have trouble with that when they come home. Of, okay, I was able to operate with this just such clear, defined purpose, and now I come home, and how do you replicate that in the civilian world? And I'm very thankful that, through this job, through working in the Senate with Corker, I have been able to find that purpose and be able to replicate much of that.
I was listening to, I don't know if you've heard any of this, that Malcolm Gladwell's got a Medal of Honor podcast, and it was a Vietnam Marine, I believe Marine. And as he's telling the story, the Medal of Honor recipient is telling the story, he's laughing at parts that you wouldn't normally laugh at.
Yeah, totally.
And they make the point in that's how you deal with things that you can't quite comprehend or you can't quite emotionally match up with anything else in your life, is that you have to have a way to express that and talk about that without just feeling crushed every time you mention it.
Yeah.
And I think that's what I hear in some of that story you're telling there. It's just to kind of, that's how you kind of get through that moment.
Yeah. And there's I remember later on, one of our Marines, Cal Gregoire, he was shot through the wrist, which we made some inappropriate jokes about that.
Sure.
But then it actually hit him in the chest into a grenade. And so this firefighter erupts around you, and you're calling in the medevac helicopter. You got Marines over there that are pinned. You're coordinating the whole thing, and the whole time you have this grenade that has a bullet in it. You're like, well, what do I do with this?
Right.
The ultimate answer was I threw it in an irrigation canal. I'm like, I don't know what to do with this thing. I can't deal with it right now. I'm going to throw it over there, and like, what happens.
And that was part one of my conversation with David Kinzler. Part two coming soon on to Morrowtown, Tennessee. This podcast is a production of NewsChannel 9, Fox Chattanooga, and Sinclair Broadcast Group Chattanooga. I hope you join me again real soon.